let's for people who aren't necessarily entirely aware, in a nutshell, what is the First Amendment? What does it guarantee in the United States?
The First Amendment is part of the Bill of Rights. It recognizes rights that exist and says the people have a right to do these things, and that government is not to touch those things. So the First Amendment contains 5 rights that says government cannot regulate these rights. They don't belong to the government. And you have the right free exercise of religion. You have the right of speech. You have the right of press. You have the right of petition and the right of assembly.
Right.
So those are the 5 rights. Now, unfortunately, only 1 in 1,000 Americans can name the 5 rights in the First Amendment, so we don't even know what they are generally.
Right.
But those are 5 things that the government is not to interfere with and limit and regulate.
Right. And is this uniquely American? Does this exist anywhere else in the world, particularly like freedom of speech as an absolute?
It did, but it was all, for example, Great Britain, we had all of these rights in Great Britain.
Okay.
And part of the reason the founders explained that we separated from Great Britain was King George III kept violating these rights. Some of these were set out back in the Magna Carta. So these have always been recognized as natural rights, God-given rights, inalienable rights, different terms. They've been written about by John Locke in the 1690s or Montesquieu in the 1750s, other nations, other philosophers, Grotius and Pufendorf, they're Dutch philosophers. A lot of people wrote about them. Not many nations had them. Mm-hmm. But in the British system, they did exist, but they were regularly violated because in the British system, you didn't have 3 branches that were separated.
Right.
You had 3 branches, but the king's over everything. So if the king went bad, it all went.
Like we were talking about before, this was when there were shared fundamental values. Truth is an absolute defense.
That's right.
But you were also telling me more, I think we have some over there, kind of fake news. If it wasn't true, it wasn't always defensible, right?
This is kind of fun stuff over here. So
okay.
Let me pull some stuff out. I'll just let you take the first shot at this. So this is an old law book. This is one of the state law books. This happens to be out of Virginia. And here's the whole section. What's the section titled?
False news. False news.
So there's false news. Here's what you do with false news. You got the right to news. You have the right to freedom of the press and speech. You don't have the right to lie. And so what happens is you can lie, but you need to be held accountable for it. So this is where we would provide provisions, and here's another one of the law books with this kind of fake news stuff. And so what would happen here, if I can get to it, again, this is an act against divulgers of false news.
Wow.
So if you're saying something that's a lie and that hurts somebody's reputation, he's got a right to defend his reputation.
Right.
So you gotta make a way to punish people who intentionally say something false or that do things that hurt your reputation. Today we've made it very, very, very hard to sue for defamation. Right. And of course today you have to show that there was great economic harm. So if somebody slanders me or libels me, it's only slander or libel if it's hurt me economically. They don't count reputation as something.
Right.
These guys thought your reputation is everything. So there were a lot of laws that said you can't, you have freedom of press and speech, but you also have to be accountable. This is one thing I love about what the Founding Fathers did with every right in the Bill of Rights. They said for every right there's a corresponding responsibility and duty. Mm-hmm. So I've got the right to free speech, but I have the duty to tell the truth when I speak. I have the right to keep and bear arms, but I have the duty not to shed innocent blood. So everything had a responsibility. And so that's
now, does this false news, does that just apply to the press, or does that also apply to personal freedom of speech?
Both. Here's a press one. This is great. It says on the front, letters from General George Washington. And so this is dated 1796, but I want to show you the first letter.
Can we show it to them so they can see?
You bet.
It looks like it's coming apart.
It is. It's old. So George Washington, and these are letters from George Washington. So what we have here is letters from George Washington. This is June the 12th of 1776.
Oh.
So we have Washington in the middle of the Revolution. This is a letter that was printed from Washington, apparently, in a New York newspaper. And in this letter, Washington takes this tone of, I don't know what to do here. What I'm doing in this revolution is the wrong thing. We shouldn't be doing this. We don't have a moral right to do this. I don't think this is going to turn out right. The whole thing is just a real downer. Mm-hmm. Except he never said any of that. That was the press making that up.
I was going to say, it doesn't sound like my Georgie.
That's right. It was not George. This was done by a newspaper editor in New York to build sentiment against the revolution. Get the patriots, these guys are all radicals, they're all crazy.
Sure.
Washington doesn't even think they're right. and everybody loved Washington. So
Right.
so this was the press doing false news.
And what were the consequences for that?
Well, the guy got exposed. First thing was when they exposed it, and America still had enough of a moral fiber back then. They didn't like being lied to.
Sure.
And so at that point in time, that's it. He's no longer a press guy anymore because nobody's going to buy his stuff. He had a critic back then. There's a guy named William Cobbett that just absolutely would not let up on him in the papers. He's a quack. He's a killer. He's killing his patients.
Can we show this too for them? Sorry, I know.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry.
Keep it all for yourself.
You keep telling me. That's all right. I'm selfish that way. This is just. So this is an action. This is a court report. And what happened, this guy beat on Rush for years and years and years, and Rush ignored him as much as he could. And finally, he said, my reputation, I got to do something. So he took the guy to court, and in court, he won a huge settlement against the guy.
So back then, was that like 4 nickels?
It was, back then it was $5,000.
Okay.
That wouldn't even get you an attorney hired today, but back
Right.
then that was a huge settlement. Yeah, back then. And so $5,000, and he gave it all to charity, because what he wanted was his reputation back. He didn't want the press having, and this guy particularly who was writing in the press. Thomas Jefferson, what happened in the election of 1800 was Thomas Jefferson, the libel and slander against him has reached a level that has never been seen in any other political campaign. Mm-hmm. We talk about negative campaigning today. We're a bunch of wimps. I mean, you read what was said about Jefferson back then. He was a murderer. He killed a wife and 8 kids, and he's abolishing the Navy, and he's finding every Bible, and he's collecting them and burning them. I mean, the stuff that was out about him.
Sounds like Bernie 2020. But yes,
there you go. Well, nothing changes over time.
Yeah,
200 years later,
only one actually didn't happen.
So he's got all this stuff, and we've got a whole bunch of these articles about him, this negative stuff, and he's writing his friends and saying, that's not true, and we all know that's not true, and history has proven it wasn't true. And this is the period of time in which he was accused with fathering children with Sally Hemings.
Right.
Slave and Monticello.
A lot of people still believe that.
Well, in November of 1998, the report came out by Joseph Ellis in Nature and Science magazine and said, we now have DNA evidence Jefferson did it. We know he did it. Mm-hmm. Actually, Eugene Foster's the guy who did the DNA test. I talked to Eugene. We talked to him. He said, no, I told him that. We did not even use Jefferson's DNA in the testing. And so what happened, Joseph Ellis was a huge fan of Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton was being impeached for the Monica Lewinsky stuff at the time, and he thought, if we can say Jefferson did that, we can say Jefferson's a great president. This had no effect on his presidency. And so Ellis had actually been part of a full-page ad in the New York Times on how great Jefferson was, shouldn't be impeached, and this seemed to help it. Okay. So when the piece came out, and by the way, we talked to Eugene Foster, he did a second DNA testing, and same thing. There's no evidence that Thomas Jefferson did this. So to this day, everybody knows there were 211 news outlets that carried the announcement that Jefferson did it. Mm-hmm. 6 weeks later, they pulled the story back and said, sorry, we were wrong, but only 11 outlets carried the retraction story.
Was it kind of one of those first story front page retraction,
Absolutely.
Somewhere in the sports section?
That's right, in the advertisement section.
Somewhere next to Garfield in the comics.
Exactly. Yeah. And so people today still think Jefferson did it. Jefferson, back then, he said, I'm not going to take these guys to court. He said, I could easily disprove them in court. I can show. He said, but you know what? I trust the good judgment of the people. I trust that there's a God in heaven before whom these liars will stand, and they'll have to account to him. He went through 3 reasons he just didn't think it was worth taking to court. It's interesting that today, one of the reasons the critics of Jefferson used, they said, he never denied the affair with Sally Hemings, therefore he's guilty of it. Yeah. No. So he's a guy that did not take advantage of his ability to prove his innocence back then, and today we say, well, he must have done it. So, but Rush did, and so we have a different opinion of Rush. It's an interesting thing because we look at voting as a right. They did not. They didn't see voting as a right, they saw it as a responsibility. It was a duty. It was something you owed. It was you choosing your government under which you live, and if you've committed a heinous crime, you shouldn't be choosing the leaders because your whole moral sense is skewed. If you think it's okay to take somebody's life, you're not the one we want choosing our leaders. Right. And so there was an exclusion that happened there. You have proven yourself unworthy of knowing the moral sense of what your leader should be. And so for them, there was a penalty. And even as I grew up in school, because I obviously have white hair, you don't, it was a big deal to lose your right to vote. And that was a deterrent to crime, actually. Voting was so important to us that when we were reminded that if you do this, you lose your right to vote, oh, I'm not going to do that. That was actually a deterrent. It would not be today.
Right.
Because we're so sloppy with that right and we don't cherish it.
Or you could lose your right, obviously, to carry a firearm.
That's right. And that was big stuff.
Yep.
And so we understood how important those rights were. Now we're kind of an entitlement mentality. This is what the government owes me. And it's not. Those were rights that we exercised. And so at that point, the right to choose self-government, to choose leaders who would not be corrupt, who would not exercise power wrongly, who would keep government limited, etc., that was a really big deal.
Yeah.
But we don't teach that civic responsibility the same way. So today we just throw, well, anybody that has 2 legs or 1 leg or no leg, or anybody can vote.
Yeah. So outside of lying, outside of libel and slander, are there any limitations on individual speech as it relates to the First Amendment?
The limitations are accountability of telling the truth,
yeah,
or at least not hurting someone's reputation for lying.
Well, it's not only that. I think it's even more pure than that. It really is distilled to truth, because people often say, right, well, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater.
That's right.
You can if there's a fire.
That's
you can't
right.
lie, because that could cause physical harm
And
to
that
somebody.
is the
People could
point.
get trampled. You know?
That is the moral sense that was there. Was truth was the bottom line. You're
Yeah.
after truth. And we may have differences of opinion. That's why you rarely see slander or libel cases in the abolition time, because there was 2 opinions on
Right.
the worth of blacks. Those are opinions.
Yeah.
But to absolutely come out and say that you said this when you didn't, or that I accuse you of something you had no part in, that's where it crossed the line.